Joe Rogan is not only the host of the famous show Fear Factor or a UFC announcer, he also hosts a successful podcast shared on Spotify titled The Joe Rogan Experience. Today, we discuss a recent guest of his who shared insights into agriculture. And to jump ahead a little bit, you're talking about carbon. They briefly talked about it as well, and he said that the ruminant is better for with natural grass. Jeez, they are better at processing natural grass, and it's far superior than grain, which I can see because you're using equipment, you're using processes that probably they provide emissions while creating the grain. So I can see that. And it also helps, like you said, return the seed back into the soil, and it kind of pushes it in, and it's used that way. And his example too is carbon goes into grass goes into the animal, and it goes into products, us and stuff, and then goes back into the air, and it comes right back through. And he's like, that is one of the mitigators of climate change is pasture use. It's a natural cyclical model that's been around for thousands of millions of years. There's nothing wrong with continuing what nature has always had. And I absolutely agreed with that. I thought that was a great way of putting it, of saying, this has always been around like this. Maybe the way we go about creating feed, hay, grain, stuff like that, maybe I can see where that causes emissions and stuff. But he's like, the most natural way to do it is keep them out in the pasture doing animal things.
Well, and here's the difference between now us and them again, and its location is we're required. We must feed our animals. You know what? That's not true. We are not required to feed our animals in wintertime, but they're going to be pretty damn poor looking in the spring, those that survive.
And they may abort the calves inside of them for their body to make it through. Yeah.
Right. So there's a sustainability issue there as well. And when you have those high peaks of, they're putting on a lot of fat, they're doing well in the springtime, they're on the gain. June, July, they work beautifully. They look great. I mean, their bodies are working like they should. And then they have a calf that they're sustaining. After that, they've had the calves before, but they're still peaking out on their gain. They're rebreeding. And then you work into the fall, the winter, and they've got nothing to eat. What are you going to end up with? It's going to be ugly. So I don't think they have to feed near as much down there. I think they'd probably depend on full-time grazing, which, God, I wish we could do that. That would be fantastic. So you've got a whole nother issue there where we're at. And I know there's going to be somebody say, well, idiots, move south. Right? I mean, it's a choice to be here, but and it is and it isn't. I mean, there's no way we could move this or sell this and go somewhere else and buy something of like kind quality. Ain't going to happen. It's not going to work. So my whole point to this is we still have all these variables that we can't control, but we try to change and do the best we can with what we can. And we have the same things that he has. We have the ability to sell grass fat animals. We've got that ability, and we can have a grass fat animal go to slaughter for a customer or a couple of customers. They each buy half. That we have to take this very same day, someone that is grain fed and finished like we would like to eat, a nice, tender, tasty piece of meat. We could take those two animals at the very same day, take them to a slaughter plant, and provide those two products the same way at the same time. Handled differently for the last 60 or so days, but still have that ability to do that and not change appreciably what we're doing, except for putting a little bit more feed into one over the other. Could we reduce what we're doing as in this carbon footprint stuff? I mean, I still am, it's like the whole story isn't being told. You take developing nations like China as a developing nation, you gotta be kidding me. Look what they do to pollute, and then we're the ones that are being held back with what we're doing in order to offset them. That's just crazy. Anyway, again, and geopolitics.
And I've looked at charts too. They say it's how they say that is we emit more per capita. And well, yeah, no kidding. When you have
Yeah,
3 billion people in your country, like it's pretty easy to dilute that by person, you know,
right.
like
Exactly.
but yeah,
Uh,
whatever. So
so,
you hit on some important things though. I'm gonna gloss over the financial aspect that he brought up because I think we're not tied into machinery like that.
no.
We're not really tied into anything. Like we've made it very clear we're not beholden to a bank right now. So I don't think that's a problem. Educationally, none of us have well, I shouldn't say that. Braden does. All of us other than Braden don't have education that directly relates to agriculture whatsoever. And technically, Braden doesn't, but he understands grasses and stuff. And he did go to the College of Agriculture for that in Montana State. So I could
But
see where Mr. Harris is saying you're getting pushed information because, like you said, the funding and everything for the land grant university. But
right.
uh,
But look at it this way. He's in a way he's absolutely right.
no, I
In
agree.
being the silos, because your mom and I both have the same undergraduate degree of biology and chemistry, which helps,
Yeah,
you know, but that's very linear as well. And some of my when he talked about some of the professors you have, that some of them are soil professors and some
yeah,
of them are, grass or a nutrition professor. And the nutritionist doesn't know squat about the soils. And that is
yeah.
very true. That in a lot of ways, you don't get that holistic approach. Now,
Yeah, here you go. I got it because it was later in the conversation, but I'm going to highlight it so that we don't come back over it. He said, exactly what you said, the silos of information, because there is a complexity to the system, but it's not treated as such. And he said,
right,
there's no systematic understanding of the process rather than this is my lane, this is what I know, this is how I'm going to teach it. And he said,
right,
like you provided, animal nutrition is everything about nutrition to the animal, but nothing about the soil. And then animal care, like veterinary care, stuff like that, husbandry, but there's nothing about the nutrition to the animal. So,
right.
so more or less, it's the exterior of the animal rather than the interior as well. And so I thought that was a really great example of they're looking at their spot that they're focused on their little computer, but they're not looking over to the right and going, oh, you have something to do with what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just this is what I do. This is all I know. This is all I'm going to teach. And
Right.
and then he brought up the teaching course as a whole system, and the Michigan State University is the only one that he knows that follows the system he uses for the holistic approach, and that the big ag continues to fund land grant universities, and it's like the how-to model and manual and to incentivize people to
Well, you
be
just
like what they want, where it's cheap and fast and easy and thoughtless, is what he said.
well, but think about it. If what he's saying is correct, and his anecdotal evidence is there that big ag, big business supports the education, and so we basically as producers, we are the company store for that industry.
Sure, sure, yeah,
I mean, it's just to spread out more in the model of how can we sustain that for our own, lower right hand corner of the spreadsheet for make that look black and not red. And anybody else up in that spreadsheet, you're going to have some black and red mixes, and if the reds go away by attrition, we don't care. We're still worried about ourselves on the bottom line, and
right.
that's where we're at, I think, and we're seeing that today with a lot of farmers and ranchers that are going out of business because they are squeezed so hard and can't do it. Which
Well,
now
that's
I
the
don't want to. That's going into a whole different
Well, yes and no,
thing.
because that's the last question that I had for the most general question I had recently. The five things he pointed out, and that's the
Right,
last one that he provided was low risk, low return, high risk, high return. He's saying he's doing high risk stuff. At this point, it's probably not so much because he's been around for 25 years doing what he's doing and
right.
slowly gotten deals with places like Whole Foods, which we'll talk about at the very end. It's got that 5-step model that I really want to touch on. But he's saying what we're doing in terms of the industrial model, the the modern stuff where you just produce and then you sell to the ring and then you get your paycheck at the end of the year. That's the low risk, low return. He's like, well, yeah, you're not going to get high payout because you're doing what everybody else is doing as low return,
Right.
which to an extent I understand what he's saying, but that
Yeah.
doesn't negate the fact that what we've pointed out before too, packers have artificially deflated those costs because again, what you just pointed out, it's okay because it's attriting everybody else and it's making me go in the black. I don't have red anymore. It's fine.
Right,
I have black on my right
right.
hand corner of the
For
spreadsheet. So
as long as it lasts.
right. People aren't looking at the
No,
holistic approach.
right. And no, and notice this the names that he threw out there for the Packers were the very same
Oh
ones
yeah.
that we. I mean,
JBS,
yeah,
Cargill,
he's
Tyson,
yeah,
all of us.
yeah, the national or when national was purchased, but yeah,
Yep.
and we're kitty corner across the U.S. from him,
Hmm.
completely different everything. He even talks funny, and we don't.
Yeah,
And
exactly. He
yeah,
talks slow and he talks funny.
yeah. So affected by the same infrastructure of the entire uh, agricultural environment, if you want to call it that, as a business environment. So I don't know. Is this a good time to talk about that? The five parts of the Whole Foods.
No,
Uh,
I really want to get that at
all
the
right,
end because I
all
think
right,
that's going to be a lot. But the next one that they had was costs, and we can kind of go over this because we've talked about this I think at length when it came to previous discussions. But I just want to at least address it. And he said that there's consumer expenses and then there's externalized expenses. And what he said was for the consumer, it's you're going to get cheaper beef but more expensive chicken because the industrial
mm-hmm.
process is hidden in some of the meats and not others. It takes more work to get more meat for a
Right.
chicken than it does for a beef. I'm like, okay, I get that. But then the externalized expenses of, wastefully abundant, whereas we, again, low risk, low return, 14 cents to the dollar for farmers currently, farmers and ranchers. And he says, you call big ag and, the checks come with your product. Big ag takes the risk. We really don't. So therefore, that's why you get that. I wanted to gloss over that. It again relates to what we just said. But if you had anything else to kind of add to that.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's like this is what you get because you're not taking a higher risk.
Right.
This is what you get. But at the other part of that is, and it's a ways off of his model from that, and hang on to that thought is this is what you get. The other part of that is he says, look, I am providing food to people who don't mind paying for high quality food, what he
Yes.
calls high quality, right? And he says, I'm not just selling to just anybody. And in a way, he is through his other um, like what do you say, Publix
Yeah, so they're
Kroger,
mostly on the East Coast and the South is Publix, Kroger.
right?
Uh, there was another one that I think he mentioned, but yeah, they're famous. They're kind of like for us Albertsons. What would be
Yeah,
Albertsons or Butcheries? It's what you
right,
find in the South, Southwest,
right.
East.
So, but he's saying he's still marketing to those people because he's marketing the grass fed,
Right.
no hormones. I mean, and the animal welfare. I mean, he's tapping in or trying to tap into that emotional
Mm-hmm.
person coming to the counter and say, "Well, I love food,
They're
and
also
I want my
buzzwords for the
food to
last
feel good."
decade.
Yes, exactly right. They're marketing terms, but so he says, "Hey, I'll do that. I'll sell to those people. That's what I'm looking for." But he would stay in business how long if he was taking that 14 and a half cents spent on the dollar? Because he's taking significantly more than that. He's
Mm-hmm.
taking another 30%, right?
Right. At
I
least.
think was the term what he used or somewhere in there.
I probably missed
Um,
that part. I was
yeah,
focused on
and
trying to
maybe
notes and
yeah,
stuff,
and
but
I may be mixing that up with some, but at any rate, it's still he's getting more for that.
yeah.
So, but he says he's taking the risk. Well, okay, is he or isn't he? I don't know. How much of a risk is there once you have something that's in his model? Now it's just marketing. The risk could be still low. We could have our risk as the way it is and increase our profits. And guess what we're doing? Just that. But our profit change or try to increase does two things. One, it gets us a little bit more per animal. Yeah, I'm putting a little bit more effort into it because, frankly, farmers and ranchers don't count. You don't work for $1 an hour. You just work, and you don't expect anything out of it. You don't get
Right.
paid per hour. So it's just something else I have to do in order to get this animal to a spot where it's consumable. So we're doing that, but it's not enough to offset what we're not getting in these low years on our monocultural type of side of the business where we're producing something that goes to somebody else. Now, along with that part of it, are we selling beef directly to a consumer at a lot higher dollar amount than they would get through the store? The answer is no. They're getting it
Uh,
cheaper,
right.
significantly cheaper. So in a way, our model is out of whack, but it's because of the marketing.
Well, and I think that would go to his point of the consumer expenses because you will get cheaper beef, but your chicken is going to be more expensive because it's going to take more handling. It's going to take more of
Right.
the process. I completely
Right.
understand because again,
Totally
to get
understand.
the same amount of meat that you're looking to get, let's say it's a pound of meat, it's easy to cut off a pound of meat off of a beef carcass.
Right.
To get a pound of meat on a chicken, it's going to take at least the whole chicken, you know?
But well, it does, but how long does it take to produce that chicken to get to that point?
Good
That's it.
point.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not if you got a 2-year-old chicken, that's a pretty damned old chicken. It had better been producing eggs, and at
Yeah.
that point, then it's not a meat chicken. Those
Yeah.
things are, you what are 100 days, maybe?
I
I
have no
don't know.
idea.
I'm just
I couldn't
I'm
talk.
throwing it out of the top of my head. I think it is somewhere around there, 90 to 100 days on the outside, depending on the meat bird. Different species grow differently. And he's right. Chickens are meant to scratch. They're meant to pick up their feed, provide it, have it, and you have a symbiosis there. If you have a garden, they've
Yeah.
got chicken crap going, which is pretty hot, high nitrogen, but they're also eating bugs off of some of your plants that you're trying to grow. Potato bugs, birds love potato bugs. Potato bugs bad for potatoes. So you have a symbiosis there that you benefit from. So you can start down that portion of it too, but um, the amount of time it takes to build a bird for food purposes is significantly less than it is for a beef. But at the same time, how many birds does it take to make, let's say you got a 3-pound bird um, versus 300 pounds of finished beef off of
Right.
a smaller, a 2-year-old, like what we're doing, 18 months to 24 months. How many birds does it take to get to that point, and how much energy and how much feed, how much do you have into them compared to that
Right.
grass-fed natural beef? So you'd have to pencil that out, and I will bet you 300 birds, or I mean 100 birds, um, is still cheaper to get to that point than allowed being allowed to roam, or go out and just scratch a living out in an area that you've got set aside where you got a lot of trees, grass, in a garden area, that kind of stuff.
You really
uh,
think so?
I think it's still going to be cheaper. 100 birds, yeah, I think so.
But I don't know because you have to do 100 butcherings. You have to go through that process 100 times. I get it. You know it's the same process multiple
Right.
times. You get good at it and you fast, efficient, quick, in,
Right.
out, done. But man, I feel like doing that versus letting an animal roam around and then eventually, once you're done with it, you butcher it and you have 300 pounds sitting there. It'd be interesting to have a log of care to see, you know, which one takes more resources and time versus the other.
Well, and I think you could do that right now on a monocultural type of uh, organization like what we've got here. We've got similar to the Amish. They're not the Amish. They're about high tech, and that is the Hutterites.
Yeah.
They do all of that. They raise each one of those for production, and they're keeping track of that. It'd be interesting to find out what does it take to how many dollars does it take to build a 3-pound bird for consumption?
Yeah.
How
That'd
many
be interesting to see
dollars?
if we could get one of them to talk to us. I obviously not
Yeah,
on camera because I think they'd probably be against their religion,
yeah. I don't think they'd probably
but
do
at
much on
least have a
camera.
conversation with them about that.
Yeah,
That'd be
right,
interesting.
right.
Well, that's a good way to kind of segue into production though, because I've got some miscellaneous stuff here that I think it's good for lumping into one quick thing. He said, people a year that he fed off his production, he assumed, roughly $1,000 worth of meat per customer.
Mhm.
Efficiency and resilience were like a yin and yang. The last 80 years have been solely focused on efficiency.
Mhm.
and resiliency has paid the
That,
price.
that,
So now we're trying to come back with that.
that's because your return is so low.
Right. And I agree. But then he's also saying, we should look at the form as a complex, like a body. One fault is equitable to, reputable sustainment of the system. So instead of one thing falling apart and all of it crashing, one thing can fall apart with his system, his model, and it'll make up for it. The rest of it will kind of step in.
That's
And
all that is diversification, right?
I agree, but
Yeah.
he says the industrial farming model that we have now, which we've been talking about, breaks the natural cycle of that because we're so focused on one thing that if
Sure.
one thing falters, then we'll crash. And I think
Yep.
again,
Totally agree.
looking at the hogs during COVID, that's a great example.
Right.
Um, but
Bird
I don't
flu
know.
on the production areas in for Tyson,
Yeah,
for their own our bird organization, for their meat bird productions they're all totally confined. What happens to them? It can wipe them out.
but I don't know if I necessarily agree with that because when you speak of the land, though, just because one thing falters, the land, everything just falls apart. I don't necessarily agree with that either. So I can see the process of, you're focused on an animal for production, but I don't necessarily agree that breaking the natural cycle, so to speak, destroys all that for the land either.
No, not necessarily. And I don't think it happens at once, but it can happen over time. You know,
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
and that's what I got from that. It was over time. It wasn't that it was a single thing that would be catastrophic.
Okay. Yeah. And then you alluded to it earlier was his water example. He said the
Mhm.
industrial form has broken that natural cycle, leading to what we just talked about. His side of the river was pretty clear, but then his neighbor on the other side, uh, their practices are more modern. And he said the topsoil is just running off because they're not letting it sustain itself. And going back to that complex versus complicated discussion, he said complicated, multiple things to work, one thing's out, you're done. The
Oh,
complex is multiple things work, one thing is taken over by the others, which we just talked about, and it continues to do that. Whereas also, expense and risk are greater than just a generational view of looking at, oh, we're just going to take care of it and we'll move on.
okay. I really wanted to get into this water situation too because I think some things were taken completely out of context
It's
there.
possible, yeah,
Because they showed some pictures of his place that had
right.
no farming on it, had just grass.
So there were two things. One was a video of his neighbor who's also a farmer. They do conventional practices, and it showed where the waters meet. Essentially, it looked like irrigation was being drained
Yeah.
out of the fields or something. And on Mr. Harris's side, it was mostly clear water, and so on and so forth. But then where his neighbors it was very dark and muddy and murky. Also, there was an overhead picture of the two of them, and on the right of the picture, it was a typical. It looked like it had just been plowed or tilled or something. It was a field. It was just dirt. It looked like it had just been cleaned up. On the left hand side of the picture was Mr. Harris's side, and it was very lush, green, vibrant. Had lots of grasses and trees and stuff. So to the naked eye, somebody who doesn't understand, starting with the water, to me, I could see what he was saying, but the water was also running, which creates turnover in that water and makes it murky in general. If you walk in water, guess what happens? It makes it murky because you've stirred up the ground, or the silt underneath. So that's one argument against what he's saying. The other thing too is the picture. It looked like, to somebody who's been around the farming and ranching community my entire life, but not a farmer, it appeared as though that man had either just plowed his field, just seeded it, or just tilled it, and it was being left alone. And then on the other side, Mr. Harris he doesn't really farm. He just does like more or less ranching where the animals are working and
Mhm.
doing their own thing. And that's a significantly different way of approaching agriculture. So yeah, with that, I'll let you take it the rest with that.
Well, because here's what I'm looking at. For instance, a river that everybody I think would probably be fairly familiar with is the Yellowstone
In
in the
our
early in
in
our part of the
our
country.
area, they'll know
Yes,
that.
Yellowstone's a pretty famous place.
But the river's not. They don't know that's actually a river.
Okay, where does that come from? Where does that river flow from?
It could flow from the mountains. Various small
Where
streams, creeks, everything from the mountains, like the Beartooth specifically, that come down.
okay, where is the origin of it? It's Yellowstone Lake in Yellowstone Park.
Okay.
Okay, flows out, and you're right. There are lots of tributaries to it. When you get a storm, and I could see this when I was a warden, and I was running that river in a jet boat, looking for people, just regular compliance. Or, you know what? I don't even know how many river rescues that I performed in the time I was on that. Dozens. No idea. Anyway, you could get a storm in the summertime. Let's say it's past the early runoff, and you're talking August. That water is pretty dang clear,
Mm-hmm.
very clear. There's not a lot going on in it. And if you got a rainstorm that put down um, an inch of rain, or let's say even a half an inch at a very fast rate, say you had a little hail with it, it was a summer storm, fairly violent, and it occurred in the park, about 2 days to 3 days later, you would see that water get murky down by the Billings area because of all of the wash that had taken place into that river, natural wash from the tributaries coming up off of the ground, uh, uh, dropping down into the small, even just little coulees that drop in it, or not even a full-time waterway, but water that's funneled into that river. And for 100 miles downstream, there you have it. You can see the effects of that. That's just natural runoff. Now, what I noticed in that picture that you're talking about is a lush, green, uh, heavy populated, grassy area will not run off a lot of dirt.
Mm.
It's bound. And that's part of what keeps riverbanks in place. Some of your
Yeah.
natural ecology, heavy root bound materials don't wash on a normal flood, or shouldn't even say flood, but a normal wash of water from rainwater. It just doesn't have the turbidity and the force and the hydraulics in that water to wash the ground. Now, if you had nothing on that right next to it, yeah, dirt is going to get washed in there. I
Yeah.
mean, you could
That's a
draw
great
a line.
example. Yeah.
Okay. So what I saw in that picture was not just that there was an irrigation pivot next to this nice lush area. There was also standing water in that.
Mm.
And there was standing water that is much more than you would have if you had irrigated that. You're not gonna flood and saturate your ground in normal irrigation, because it does no good. You're flooding the plant, and it can't overcome that water, that just standing water. You don't have anything growing in that unless you're growing rice. So what I saw is a context issue there.
Yeah.
And I
That
can
makes
show
sense.
you, to a river, the Clark's Fork River, when it's being heavily irrigated upstream, where that dumps into the Yellowstone, which is clear or nearly clear. You'll see that same effect with a tributary and the Stillwater River running into the Yellowstone the same way. The Clark's Fork is much more um, a stark contrast, but you've got exactly the same thing happening naturally with no storms, just some runoff. Now, that doesn't mean that that's a good thing. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is there's a contextual thing there where I think you had some heavy rains, and they had the opportunity to go out there and take a picture and show, look, this is what's going on. That doesn't happen every day.
All right.
I think that was taken completely out of context based on what I saw in that picture, and I could be wrong. I may be wrong that I didn't see what I thought I saw, and I thought I saw standing water close to there, which means they had an abundance of rain, which at the same time surprised me. Why would they have a pivot in that area if they get that kind of moisture? But that may be a specific crop driven something or another. I don't know, but that was to me um, not an everyday thing, and they made it sound like this is what happens every day off of this, and that's clearly, there's no way in hell that is doing that every single day.
Yeah, and I'm
Um,
trying to pull up that comparison real quick, see if I
yeah,
can find it with a quick Google search.
yeah, because if they were doing that, um, they're going to lose all their topsoil, which that is a problem. I mean, I'm not saying, like I said, it's not a good thing. You're
Right.
losing topsoil,
Yeah,
but
I'm not seeing it.
you're not going to last very long. And that seemed to be kind of some red Georgia clay type, good loamy soil uh, that they're watching wash down that creek that goes through there, a little river. I mean, to me, that was more like a creek,
Yeah,
a
or
good
an
sized creek.
irrigation ditch of some sort. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a little bit bigger than that because you wouldn't have that much wastewater. I mean,
Yeah.
that would be just crazy to have that much wastewater.
I'm
So
not finding it, but yeah,
yeah,
I agree.
but I think that's taken out of context a little bit too to bolster the argument. And so that also gave me a little bit of a pause for credibility there. I mean, if you're going to
Hmm.
tell a story, tell the whole story, tell
Right.
everything. Uh, and I don't think one of the problems there is that he skirted around and was a big credibility issue for me was that again, what you're doing to the soils. And yes, I mean, you've got to maintain your soils. I mean, they learned that in the 30s,
Right.
the Dust Bowl days. Look what happened just with some of the farming practices in areas that
Strip
shouldn't
farming.
be farmed, or block farming.
Yeah.
And I see they're block farming again now, but they're doing it with a no-till. You know, they're not tilling things, which I just had I was at a school last week or week before it ended, and there was a gentleman there that I met that was a lifetime farmer, and we got to talking about grasshoppers, as guys in agriculture will do. And he says, I think there's more grasshoppers now than ever before because it's an unintended consequence of no-till farming.
Mm.
And I said, why? And he says, you're not breaking up that ground and killing those grasshopper eggs.
Oh,
And I was like,
well,
okay,
that makes sense.
well, does it? I don't know. It's a theory.
Yeah.
It could. I don't know. So
Yeah.
here's the good and the bad. You break that ground up and the wind comes up in this country and it takes it. You
Right.
try to do a no-till to maintain your topsoil. Now you're
Grasshoppers.
disturbing the soil that you never should be disturbing anyway. My opinion, not,
Yeah.
I mean, that's not a fact. That's my opinion. It should be grass. And you may be helping a species of insect that you don't find desirable. I mean, I don't know anybody that really likes grasshoppers unless those that like to cover them in chocolate. You know, but you think about that and it's like he may be right. I don't
Yeah.
know, but it surely makes some sense because it's been the last 15, 20 years that we've had a lot of beginning of no-till farming in order to make more production again year after year and give that ground a break occasionally, but bigger blocks of ground in order to come into that same sort of thing. But topsoil is king. You got to have topsoil. Same thing with his irrigation and the comparison to was newly plowed. You're exactly right. That thing was what was newly tilled, and I thought I saw standing water on it. And like, okay, I know what's going on there. I've seen this before.
Yeah.
Um, just in grasslands, you'll see that because of the natural runoff after a storm. So, um, yeah, I'm done with my rant. Enough said about that.
I'll take your uh grasshopper comment and I'll run with that real quick. And that was the government incentives that he pointed out as well. You know, lobbyists create big bills for big ag is what he said. And I'm like, okay, I can get with that.
Mm-hmm.
But then he specifically used an example of like the bald eagles. And I saw some similarities that we have with wolves
Mm-hmm.
specifically. And he was saying the predation of the bald eagles on his poultry, you know, is he had a process where essentially they said, you know, because you lost so many thousands of dollars up due to predation by the bald eagles on your animals, we approve this. This makes sense. But then it kept going through the bureaucratic process, and he says, tying it back to the original comment, big ag has influenced the government to push against the farmer and the rancher because as it's gone through local, then it was state, and then it was like regional, and then it's getting up towards the national level, and they keep approving it, but it's like, how much longer is this farmer going to hold out because they're just trying to use it as an example to get you to just give up. And he's getting to the point where he's just aggravated. He's got lawyers dealing with it. And he thought that was just it's nonsense because it's big ag trying to use their ability to not pay farmers
Mhm.
and ranchers, so on and so forth. And then eventually said, now he changed practices, like you said, with moving uh, the animals around and having guard dogs. So now it's not as many. And he doesn't have a problem not claiming those because he says it's kind of his tithing to nature, one or two,
Right.
but the large amounts is what he had issues with. So while I run out real quick, I'm going to let you just kind of play with that and kind of throw out your ideas on kind of what he said with that.
Well, I don't think he's wrong there. Again, it's all about when you have a business, you don't necessarily have just the commodity that you can control the the outcome on. You have inputs, and inputs are what can kill you. Inputs are what is your overhead or your driving expenses that you try to minimize. So if you can control a aspect of what you're doing, and I'm talking not just now in the family farm and ranch type business. I'm talking what he calls big ag. If you can stop the bleeding of payouts that you are competing with small guys, and you're a big ag person, and you go, yeah, um, I'm gonna say that the coyote populations or the wolf populations or the eagle populations, yeah, they're really not a problem. That's these little
Right.
guys just whining about that, trying to stand there with their hand out. That's money that is now not appropriated for that purpose. But on the other hand, hey, I've got this big insect problem on my big ag place.
Mm-hmm.
I need those funds for that. It's still predation. It's a different form. And it's like, okay, if they can control, and the big dog says to your federal level, I mean, not the state level, I'm talking USDA federal, and it all does trickle down to your local offices. But if you can control that and stop that at that point from being paid out, that's saving you some steps in order to divert that money back to yourself. So he's got a good point there, and I can't disagree with that. I think we've all in agriculture seen some small, probably
Version of it.
versions of that, or at least some examples of it here and there. And of course, we all live in our own space. I mean, you talk about uh, the old adage about keeping your nose to the grindstone. People in farm and ranch land, that's what they do. We're pretty consumed with what we do because our time is everything, and that's what we spend our time on. So um, the larger you get, I think you can step back from that a little bit, and you can start going to some more of these places and become more of the big ag on a small scale, and see where some of the advantages of what you do can be changed to do that at that level for an income. And it's not necessarily an income source, but it's to being able to recoup some of your cost that you're putting into a business, or either recoup it or you can stop it uh through a competition. That makes sense. I mean, it's it's kind of it's kind of convoluted in a way, but I mean, you see it happen. How much influence you got is one thing. Some don't,
Yeah.
some do.
I'll before we get to the final part that you've been wanting to get to, uh, I'll talk about something that we did briefly discuss. We talked about like Bill Gates and such, but what he this whole section that I kind of wrote down was a lot of the use in technology, and I'll go through everything that was kind of pertaining to that. And one of them being plant-based proteins, which everybody, if they're familiar with this channel, knows how vehemently against I am on that one. But he said, the one person controlling land, like Bill Gates being a technocrat, using technology as the solution for every problem. He said we should revert back to the use of farming and ranching to offset carbon emissions, not technology. Use the natural processes. So that was his continued
Mhm.
theme. Money seems to be the answer rather than using agriculture. His point being, if an airline is over using their carbon credits, what they do is they just pay the money and they pay the fine. And in my thought, it's the idea of the immediate fix rather than the actual fix.
Right.
It's just that, oh, I'll fix it by throwing money at the problem rather than actually creating a solution. And then he
Well,
said
who really pays for that? The
yeah,
consumer
exactly.
again.
Yeah. But he said also the militant. plant-based protein community is what he was mostly against. And it was those who force others to eat like them, not those saying, hey, this is what we have, but it's like, you should eat like I do. And I absolutely agreed with that. He said the damage to the environment is on both sides.
Mhm.
Whether you eat 18 million people eat only meat or 18 million people eat only plants, the damage is the same, just in different versions. And
Right.
so you have to understand how you're going to go about that. And then his final part was the management of the carbon footprint, the technology versus the land. The lower the carbon, it's going to be more effective if you keep things more local, so less shipping. And I completely agree with that too. If you're not going to ship stuff 1,500 miles away using a truck or a airline or something,
Mhm.
rather than taking it down the road and providing it, you're emitting less emissions that way, because you're not traveling so far to produce the same amount of food for somebody far, far away. So
Right.
that to me was kind of all the technology part. He even talked about, the the bigger places like LA, New York, Miami, Beijing, China. They're looking to use technology to pull carbon from the air and remove it, so that you don't have these emission issues that they're saying is, destroying our ozone and so on and so forth. And he said, yeah, it's a cool idea, especially for locations like that. But really, the answer is go back to the use of natural processes, what nature gave us, which was animals and grass, to offset all those things. So now I'll let you have fun with that.
Well, what is it that they're pulling from the air to put into the ground? Well, there's good
Talk to
carbon
scientists.
sequestration, right?
Yeah.
I know you're a history guy, but most of it they're pulling out is, and you hear the greenhouse gas is what? Carbon dioxide,
Yeah.
right? What is it that plants need for photosynthesis
Carbon
and
dioxide.
what?
Yeah. I learned that one in,
Hmm.
in middle school. I remembered that one.
Okay. So you've got that. So part of the issue is, and we do, and I can't disagree with some of the deforestation, some of that
Yep.
stuff, but if you replace that, if you take that deforestation out and then completely gone and you don't do anything with it, yeah, you've lost some CO2 or some oxygen production, and you've limited the CO2 that is taken up. However, most of that is returned back into some farming practices that produce as much oxygen and take more CO2. So that's again, it is a viewpoint from someone with a specific agenda about not telling quite the whole story.
Yeah. And
Um,
I could see what you're saying with the negative emissions, because if you're growing plants and then you're going and cutting the plants, they've used a bunch of CO2 to
right,
produce themselves. And then at that
right.
point, you're just harvesting what's left. Yeah.
Well, no, and his point to he didn't like the fact that he was sending foods clear up into the East Coast, New England, uh, and far away, because it was offsetting what he was trying to do, and he was trying to encourage more and more people to get back to the sustainable model that he has and sell
Yeah.
that food at a local area. My immediate thought to that was, okay, how much of an area around a population of 18 million can you grow to sustain? Goes back to my original
Right.
my original argument was you can't produce enough. What are you going to do with these people that don't have enough food? Now what? And yeah, we've as a species, we're boxing ourselves into a corner. There's no question about it. How we get out of that is another matter. Nature will take its course, and it will do what is called the J curve of extinction. J curve of extinction, and you've heard me talk about this before. Populations, it's a natural cycle. They go up to where they overpopulate. Something happens in a overpopulated um, type of environment or ecosystem where all of a sudden something happens. Either you have a famine or
Yeah.
disease or something, and that number sharply drops off to almost the extinction level, and then it starts to repopulate and come back, and it's a J curve of extinction is what that's called. That's
I,
biology. I mean, it's ecology 101, right?
I would say I've seen that twice, at least in my lifetime. That's blue tongue with antelope. And what's currently going on and I think it's coming on the back end of it, is chronic wasting disease with deer.
Those could be two very good examples of that.
Yeah.
Uh, and eventually, hopefully, and I think what happens is some of those remaining populations build up an immunity to that, or
Yep.
it's no longer affected over some time. Some of those populations will still get it, but then pretty soon that becomes a non-issue.
Yep.
Completely different biological tangent we're going to go on to here, but or could go on to it. His premise to that was all about, and he said he's a big global warming advocate of this is an issue and this is how we solve it. But he still never did say how you're going to do that with all of these populations that need food.
Right.
Are you a guy that's okay to just let them die?
Well, and essentially
As long as you don't know them.
what he came back to was what we said at the beginning is if you're going to support it, you do have to do the industrial model, but
Right.
you give up the fact of what he keeps saying is and preaching is sustainability of the earth.
Right.
It's one or the other. He never came up with a solution for both.
Well, and that's kind of where, you know, we try to ride that fence on both sides. We try to do things as naturally as possible, but still where we feel we need to, we step in with a little bit of the chemical type use where we have to for, you know, weed control, noxious weed control, that sort of things, which we're mandated to do by state law. You got to control if you got things on your place, you've got to control those. Well, in a very small population, if you see a piece of toad flax out there, you better get on it. How do you do that? The best way is really quick, small amounts of mechanical or chemical means to do that. So there's a lot of the stuff he said I agree with, completely agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And
especially the concept behind the sustainability and treating animals properly and stuff. I absolutely agreed. There were just parts that I was like for example, the biggest one was the COVID issue, the euthanization and the unhealthiness of the animal. I just like I don't know where you're getting this information. I'd like to know where you're getting it, but
and those were contextual things, like with the runoff, some of that sort of stuff that I disagree completely with. Now he made a couple of statements that his carbon sequestration on his ground, he had a lot healthier soil than anybody else did, or than he used to. I guess he really just compared himself to begin with, but then extrapolated to the neighbors without exactly saying it. But you know, from a half a pound to 5 pounds or 5%, I'm sorry, not pounds, percent of carbon in a soil sample. That's a lot. That's a big difference. You know, and having that healthy soil, if you don't have that, you've got nothing. Try to, you know, grow something in a desert where there's little to no nutrient in that sand. And sandy soil is a major portion of it, but very niche species grow in that, but not enough to survive on. So there's a lot I did agree with. I found the man very, very interesting. But I would like to nail him down on a few things like that, where I'd like to see it myself. I'd like to visit his property. I think I could poke some holes in some of the statements he made, and show, this isn't quite what you would say it is or what you would think it is. So
and giving a guy a benefit of the doubt, I think the best way I could go about that too is he would probably do the same thing for us until he saw what we did with what we have. And I think that's where it would be nice for us to see what he does and him to see what we do, and to be able to look at each other and be like, oh, this is why you do that, or why don't you try this? Because it's something he may have never thought of before. And then same with us, coming to us and be like, why don't you try it like this? And we're like, oh, you know what? Never thought of it before.
Absolutely. So, no, there's value in seeing how people do something somewhere else. Absolutely valuable. I mean, you don't know what you don't know till you've got someone saying, hey, what about? So no, I think it's very good. One of the things that I found interesting and I wanted to get to this before we ended, was the Whole Foods model of 1 through 5 plus.
Right. Hold on.
So, go ahead.
This is it. We're at the last bit, folks. All right. So I have all this information. I looked up some stuff because I thought it was important to understand before we go into it. But his idea of like greenwashing, and essentially it was, well, it's all good, which to me it was like the more vague it is, the more inclusive it is.
Of course.
It was the easier for marketing, and like you said, it's a commercial 5-step model. And originally it was created for what they called global animal partnership, which Whole Foods supported. And that's where he originally started, because he had a marketing deal with Whole Foods at the time.
Right.
And
it was self-serving.
right.
And you know what? Okay. It's a
and
market.
it was supposed to be everything was better than anywhere else you could go. And
Right.
that's kind of what it was, like both in animal welfare, which was what the global animal partnership was, and also just Whole Foods in terms of it's better for you as a human consumer as well. Makes sense. Okay. So they said the industry was set to again promote higher animal welfare, and then you started a certain step, which would be 1, and you move up in the continuum. But he said that never changed. It's never altered at all. It's always been 1 to 5, and it's never changed or improved their process. They just said it, and they've never done anything to go back and rectify or add amendments to or anything like that. It's just always been how it is.
Or move people from 1 or 2 to 5.
Right.
Yeah.
And he goes, the other thing is, here's what it is. They looked it up on the podcast, and I'm verbatim. This is what it is. It's 1 through 5 and then 5+. And I'll tell you a little bit of examples that I found in the website that pertain to these steps. Step 1, the lowest step, is you don't have any animals in cages or crates or crowding. So you take out feedlots, essentially, for us. The equitable thing would be feedlots for beef. Number 2 is an enriched environment, which was things to do. Well, we do that with our horses. We have little apples and stuff that are plastic that they can toss around and play, and they get to do whatever they want to do. It's healthy for them mentally to be able to get to that point. Mm-hmm. Enhanced outdoor access. Okay. It essentially means they can go outdoors, they can do whatever they want, and you can't restrict them, so to speak, other than to keep them from going onto the neighbor's place. It was pasture centered. So it's all primarily based on the outdoor system. That's step 4. The enhanced outdoor access was 3. Sorry, I just covered that. And then 5 was animal centered. So no physical alterations, which means in step 5, you can't castrate a bull. You can't castrate horses. That to that extent, that's what you would have to do. You'd have to leave everything intact. I think he said the only what extenuating circumstance would be if they had like horns. You could probably saw off the horn on a cow or something. But
so it didn't injure somebody else.
Right. And that's pretty much it. And then 5+, the highest that you could be rated, is it's animal centered. Everything that was just provided, 1 through 5, animal centered, and its entire life was on the same farm or ranch. Pretty much that's for us too, especially the farm to the ranch to table stuff. That's definitely us, because they don't go anywhere other than they get fed at the ranch and then they go to the butcher. Right. That's it.
Right.
So part of
I'd like to see how he manages that many animals, 5,200 head a year. Well, and really, for sustainability, you're talking 10, 11,000 head, of which about half of those, statistically, are going to be bulls. How are you going to manage that in a size of a place like that, with not castrating and then not have interbreeding? And how about, and we've talked about this.
That's a lot of extra work.
Well, and a yearling bull will breed prolifically.
Yeah.
And that alters the taste of that meat.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me how that's done. Another issue there.
Stick with me here, because I got just a little bit left.
Yep.
Out of all the 1 to 5+ on that podcast, they said only 2,451 farms and ranches are anywhere on that spectrum. It did not say how many are in 1, how many are in 2, how many are in 5+. So essentially there was no growth to improve, and therefore no incentive to be separated in the identification process. So it's like, okay, I can be part of the 5-step process, and I can do number 1, the bare minimum, and I'm still part of that 5-step process. So like, why not? Right. Now, I was curious to see, while they were talking, I did some quick Google search and threw some stuff on there that would pertain to us in that model. And I found beef specifically under step 4, and I grabbed 3 of them: hot iron branding, disbudding, and slaughter. Hot iron branding is a huge issue, especially on our YouTube channel. People hate branding, because that's the most comments I get is just hateful, negative comments about our branding practices. And we've explained multiple times why we do it, but they said face branding is prohibited. Absolutely agree wholeheartedly.
Well, that's an ethical thing for us.
Yeah. Branding on other parts of the body is permitted for steps 1 through 4. Okay. So shoulder, ribs, hip. Okay. Yep. 100% support. Branding is one of the methods used to identify cattle. Yes. Industry guidelines recommend branding on the hip area and state that cattle should never be branded on the face or jaw. Again, yes. While the practice of branding is becoming less common and other methods of identification are increasing in popularity, the most recent survey data from 2018 showed that nearly 40% of cattle are still marked for branding. Yes. Okay. Disbudding, essentially, tipping the horns or removing the horns, like we said before. It's routine, which is the removal of the tips of the horns, and complete removal of the full-grown horns are both prohibited. So complete removal of full-grown horns and removal of the tip. So they're saying you can't do that at all for this process to be part of the 5-step. Disbudding or cauterizing the horn buds before they grow into horns is only allowed before 6 weeks of age. So you have a small window.
Tipping is permitted. Typically, you don't feel them at 6 weeks of age.
Yeah, exactly. Tipping is permitted only when it is necessary to prevent the horns from growing into the animal's head or in response to behavior that puts other animals or handlers at risk. This is the same as steps 1 through 4. Disbudding is prohibited 5 and 5+. So essentially, you can't do it unless it's safety reasons. Okay, right. That makes complete sense. And even then, you still probably won't do it the whole way because there is blood underneath there. It's a live tissue, so you don't want them to bleed or anything. And
you
then
cauterize it.
The slaughtering. Here's what blew my mind. There's one simple sentence. There are no slaughter standards for beef at any step level. Holy crap. This is supposed to be a very good, sustainable process. And you're telling me there's absolutely no standards for slaughter whatsoever. So I could throw anything in there or treat them however I want when I slaughter them. And I guarantee you, it may not be perfect, but the industrialized version right now of slaughter is actually very efficient and very humane. And to say that there's no slaughter standards whatsoever in this supposed 5+ model, it blew my mind. That frankly pissed me off. I was like, you got to be kidding me.
That took a 20-year step backwards.
Yes.
At least.
No, at least.
Maybe 30, 40.
I didn't have a problem with pretty much everything up to that point. But then I saw, for beef specifically, I didn't look for anything else, but no slaughter standards for beef. I lost my mind. I'm like, okay, you lost all credibility with me, Whole Foods, when you came to this 5-step process. And they showed a stupid commercial. They're like, the 5-step process is like if you come in and you go boom. But then the 5-step process, our process is, I'm like, what does that even mean? But then you throw that nonsense on there. Oh, I got angry. I really did. That's just.
Yeah, well, and part of the problem with this is just as and I had to agree with him on this, people who are anti-beef, and only about, and we're kind of going back here a little bit, and only about like your, what is it, burger that they're trying to say is lemongrass only, or no, that's the beef. But you got that step to it, and then you've got the what's the burger that's just meat or just grass or soy?
I mean, I think it's like I just had it. It's not the ultimate burger. It's the Impossible Burger.
Impossible Burger. There you go.
Yeah.
Those people talk about, well, this is really much more sustainable because of the carbon footprint. They're actually, like you said, it's a zero balance because they're putting as much into carbon. If you subscribe to that and by using their standards, then you are by what you're getting out of it. So it's a zero, where if you're doing it his method, at least you're gaining or sequestering some back, which may be, I don't disagree. And that's kind of why we do what we do with our feeding processes in the wintertime. But that kind of thinking is exactly the same as those folks who say you should never have any beef at all. It's this very myopic, without looking at any facts. It's only about what makes me feel good and what I've been told how I should feel. And this is how you feel because these are what we say makes you feel good. So it's such a false premise in a lot of ways that it's bothersome to me.
Well, and the other thing too is a lot of the standards that they provided for the 5-step process were stuff that I guarantee a lot of farmers and ranchers already
They do.
do. And so it's
Yep.
almost like you don't exist unless you pay your monthly subscription or something like that, in which case now we'll recognize you. You know, it's
There
like
you go.
you can't be a gun toting Second Amendment supporting citizen unless you're part of the NRA. You know, that's kind of how
Yeah.
I took that. You know, it's like
Yeah. In a way,
that
yeah.
makes no
No.
sense.
Yeah. And extrapolate that to anything.
Yeah.
No, I agree. So with that, I guess, you know, we get supposedly on a good year, about 14 and a half. I think he said 14.3 to 14.7
14.3
cents
or 14.7.
on the
Yep, that was
dollar.
it.
So call it 14 and a half cents on a good year. That's what we're getting. The last few, we can't even do that. So we have to just thank you that you're better paid.